Welcome back, Combination. Today we're going to be talking about a topic that is so exciting, so thrilling. Some would say it's what coffee drinks to stay awake. Now, this topic is a topic that I've seen people get really excited about, people get really worked up about. A lot of people have different experiences in this area. And add to that, there are standards and guidelines. That topic is risk management. Now, if we were to talk to our normie friends, our people that don't work in our industry, and you were to utter the words risk management, most people would think of extreme sports, skydiving, bungee jumping, or earthquakes or some kind of natural disaster. But in our world, risk management is one of those topics that is so important. Both ISO 14971 and ICH-Q9 are the foundational frameworks in the world of risk management, but they come from different traditions and serve pharma and medical device, respectively. Today, we'll break down their origins, key elements, similarities and differences, and what they mean for combination products. If this is your first time tuning in, I'm your host, Subhi Saadeh. I've been working in medical devices, pharma, and combination products now for the last decade, and my goal is mastery. So this show is how I answer all the questions that I'm curious about. Now, whether you're in regulatory, quality, product development, or just want to understand risk management, this episode is for you. Let's get into it. Let's make sure we're on the same page about what ISO 14971 and ICH-Q9 are. ISO 14971 is the standard for risk management in the medical device industry. It's widely used to identify, evaluate, and mitigate risks associated with medical devices across the entire life cycle, from design and development into production and then into post-market surveillance. ICH-Q9, on the other hand, is a guideline for quality risk management, or QRM as it's commonly known, that was developed by ICH, and it's used, like I said, by the pharma industry. The revised version, known as ICH-Q9R1, was released more recently and incorporates updates that reflect advancements in how they think about risks, subjectivity, and the proper application of risk-based approaches. It talks about formality as well. One thing that both 14971 and ICH-Q9 are aligned on is the definition of risk. So in terms of one of the most important quote unquote first principles, the definition of risk in both ICH-Q9 and ISO 14971 is defined as the combination of the probability of occurrence of harm and the severity of that harm. In other words, when considering a product's design, use, process, software, application, environment, or any situation really, it's important to consider what can happen, and if that were to happen, how bad would it be, and how likely would it be that bad? Now, historically, these documents are influenced by each other. ISO 14971 was developed as a standard in response to the growing need for a systemic approach to manage risks associated with medical devices. It first came into recognition in the early 2000s and was aimed to create a consistent framework for medical device manufacturers to make sure that devices are safe and effective. ICH, on the other hand, as an organization, was formed in the early 90s and was focused on bringing together regulatory authorities and industry to standardize technical requirements. The goal there was to harmonize regulations across markets, and what they resulted with was a series of guidelines, ICH-Q9 being one of them, and it was introduced to fill the gap in quality management to produce, again, a clear, consistent framework of assessing risks within the pharmaceutical process. Although the standards did develop independently, there was always an understanding that medical devices and pharma were at times inseparable. And when combination products that combine drugs and devices started to become more common, it became apparent that both frameworks played a really important role. The challenge that many organizations face is how to balance those two perspectives. I wanted to note on ICH Q9R1 was it was originally published in 2005, laying the groundwork for QRM, but in January 2023, ICH released the update Q9R1 with some, I think, pretty important refinements. In terms of what's new, one of the important changes is the guidance on managing subjectivity in risk management, the risk assessments. The new version encourages the use of structured approaches to reduce personal biases when going through risks, which can lead to more consistent and reliable decisions. One way that I've seen that addressed in my past is having a QRM coordinator or something like that that's their role, is managing risks across the organization. And so their role is risk management. Your role as a requester of sorts would be to bring them in whenever you had a risk that you needed dealt with, and they would help ensure that the appropriate personnel were involved in the risk assessment that was being generated. And also they weren't, one of the things that my realtor, who was a college friend of mine, was talking to me about when my wife and I were looking at our first house was don't fall in love with the house when you're touring it. And a lot of times we, the people on project teams, are so involved, so committed, so close to the project that there's always some inherent bias. Another thing that ICH Q9R1 addresses is the formality of risk assessments. Now, this is an area that I really like, and the update recognizes that not all risks require the same level of formality and gives clear guidance on scaling your risk management activity based on the risk's potential impact and where that risk is coming from. And the formal versus informal risk assessment designation, I think, is really nice. And I know a lot of companies have informal risk assessments or formal ones that are based around a risk question. Finally, in other words, when you're doing a risk assessment that is not one of the risk assessments that's associated with development, it's really good to have a well-defined risk question which states, what is the risk associated with this particular situation? And from that perspective, generate a risk assessment and then mitigate accordingly. Now, lastly, the other emphasized point on ICH Q9R1 is risk-based decision making. It adds a lot more detail on how risks are documented and communicated so that risk decisions can be made effectively and that there's appropriate transparency through the organization. Just to tie the loop, one of the things with QMSR that is often discussed as a now adopted shift from 820 to the QMSR is that ISO 13485 in the last update really emphasized risk-based decisions across all of the different areas and not just in product development. So I think this is an area where ICH Q9R1 and the overall kind of device QMSR 13485 are pretty aligned. Now, comparing and contrasting ISO 14971 and ICH Q9, the frameworks are both about managing risk, but how they go about it is in some ways similar, but in other ways different. And their scope is also a little bit different. So ISO 14971 places a very strong emphasis on identifying potential hazards, estimating the risks associated with those hazards, evaluating whether or not those risks are acceptable, and then putting in mitigations to ensure that the appropriate level of control is in place such that the risk is acceptable. It's not just about the process of manufacturing, but the risk posed by the device itself throughout its life cycle, from initial design through production and eventually to use by the patient. ICH Q9 is a little broader. It not only looks at the risk to patient, but also the risks within manufacturing, quality management risk. It's part of the overall quality system and can be applied across different areas from product development, regulatory submissions, supplier quality, and patient risk. So I guess the way that I look at it is ISO 14971 is patient safety risk focused, and that patient safety risk can come from a few different arenas. ICH Q9R1 is more like if you were to combine the risk-based thinking that is specified in 13485 and the patient risk that's spoken to in ISO 14971. And so ICH Q9R1 could address something like the risk associated with, like I said, a regulatory inspection, or the risk associated with the use of or with a supplier situation or whatever. Whereas 14971 by itself is really patient safety focus. One other difference is the use of tools that are used for ICH Q9 and 14971. Because Q9 is a little bit broader, the tools are a bit of a mixed bag. Whereas 14971, the way that organizations may approach applying 14971 can be different. But broadly speaking, you're looking at some kind of combination of FMEA principles, fault tree analysis principles, plus a hazard analysis, and leading into something that brings it all together. And like I said, each company has its own way of merging the two, but there is a exercise of trying to figure out what all could go wrong and then tying that to the patient risk and mitigating accordingly, ensuring that risks are appropriately controlled in that. Now, one thing that I think is important to talk about on the medical device side is when you look at risk management overall, you're looking at the combination of severity, probability of occurrence, and in some cases, detectability. So severity is that you need clinicians to help you determine that, like what would happen if a situation occurs. But the rest of it is some amalgamation of clinicians, nurses, human factors, and others to try and figure out what all could go wrong with the device. ISO 14971 doesn't, a lot of people, like I said, will be quick to point out that ISO 14971 doesn't specify any tools, but there is an associated guideline 24971 that speaks to the different tools that could potentially be used and approaches. So one approach that's very often used in companies is the P1, P2 probability of harm approach, which looks at the probability of a hazardous situation occurring times the probability of that hazardous situation leading to harm as a combination of occurrence. I've seen the RPN model personally used a lot more on the drug side, where they're just looking at severity, occurrence, detectability. Now, contrast to that, like I said, ICH-Q9 provides a bunch of risk management tools that can be used, like risk ranking and filtering, flow charts, decision trees, hazard analysis, HAZOP, and others. A lot of times, like QRM processes and procedures are very broad. And one thing that I've seen done really well in some companies is like you have specialized SMEs, like I said, that can lead teams down the risk analysis versus having everyone trying to be a risk management SME. And so those are some of the areas where they're similar and different. For a combination product, it's not just enough to analyze device risks or pharma process risks in isolation, they're linked. So for instance, something like a drug-eluting stent not only needs to deliver the drug at the effective and safe dose, but the stent itself must also be safe, not causing undue harm to patients mechanically or materially or any of that. So both risk management frameworks are needed in tandem. An element of 14971 that's important for combination products is the concept of a risk management plan. There is no risk management plan in ICH-Q9. The risk management plan establishes early on in the design and development process, usually in like a planning and feasibility stage, whether it's stage 1 or stage 2, depending on how you're set up, but usually very early on. It's like design development plan, risk management plan follows its coattails very quickly. That plan outlines how risks will be managed throughout the life cycle, including assigning responsibility, risk criteria, verification of implementation and effectiveness, the different documents that'll be generated, who will be involved in each one, when the risks will be reviewed, and in many cases, now with the latest update to 14971, how post-market risk will be managed. In ICH Q9, because there's a broad understanding of risk management, I think there's a little bit more ambiguity around risk assessments, in particular to product life cycle staging. But QRM assessments in the pharmaceutical space tend to be a little bit more collaborative in my experience. So a mixed bag in terms of pros and cons there, but I think it's related to culturally. So in the medical device space, because it's mandated to align risk management principles with patient safety, teams and product development processes usually have it very well integrated such that you have a risk management plan that is in depth and planned out and looks at roles and responsibilities, how it weaves into your development process, making sure that at every exit of a design stage that you are reviewing your risk management. Because it's so planned out, I don't want to say it ends up being a checkbox exercise, but it's a little bit less of a thought exercise, I feel like, on the medical device side, because it's usually like, okay, we need to look at our design risks. What are our design risks? Whereas with ICH-Q9, it's like the flip is true. It's not really defined when a risk assessment is needed, but if a risk assessment is needed, a lot of creativity, thought, collaboration ends up happening. And so, like I said, it's a mixed bag. That's just been my own personal experience that 14971, the planning and execution is usually a lot smoother than ICH-Q9, but ICH-Q9, because it's purpose-driven, trying to address a risk situation, event, or risk question, it ends up being a little bit more collaborative. And it's like, what's the right tool for this kind of situation? And who do we really need to be involved? And yeah. So the need to align these two approaches is actually highlighted in an AMI technical report, TIR 105, which came out in 2020. And suggests that for combo products, manufacturers should consider both levels, and gives a lot more detail around how to address constituent part level risk assessments to make sure that risk management is done comprehensively. Now, there's a couple of things that I wanted to bring up from 14971 that I think are real strengths that are not really addressed at all, as far as I can tell, in ICH-Q9, and I haven't seen it in application either. The first one that is a unique concept in 14971 is the idea of state of the art, which is used to determine whether or not the benefits of a product outweigh the residual risk. I think this particular concept is really important when residual risks can't be eliminated entirely. I've had a bunch of people on in the past to talk about risk management, but if you're interested in learning a little bit more around this, now when it comes to state of the art, it's linked to the principles that deal with residual risk and how far the risk needs to be reduced or eliminated. So the three kind of levels that are typically stated in a risk management plan are as far as possible, as low as reasonably practicable, or as low as reasonably achievable. AFAP, ALARP, or ALARA. And I'm not going to get into the details of those in this episode. I did discuss it with, I don't remember if it was Naveen or Bijan Elahi, but I will find that episode and link it here if you're interested in learning about that in a little bit more detail. But I think the wider point is that 14971 provides a lot of thinking around residual risks. And then once you have that list of residual risks that's left over, what is the bar that you're setting it against? And the state of the art is what is used. So state of the art is typically a combination of assessing current technical capabilities, assessing internationally recognized standards, performance standards, clinical literature. Literature review is often done as part of SOTA assessments to understand if the risks associated with the product are acceptable compared to similar devices on the market. This kind of level of rigor is not explicitly stated in ICH Q9, where risk acceptance as a quote unquote risk acceptance is a little bit more straightforward and defined as just a decision to accept risk. The other, I think, really, in my opinion, important critical element that is spoken to in 14971 as a concept that is not really dealt with in a very meaningful way in ICH Q9 is verification of implementation and verification of effectiveness. 14971 is a little more stringent area in this area. It requires two distinct verification activities where verification of implementation makes sure that a risk control is actually in place, and the verification of effectiveness makes sure that control is actually effective at mitigating the risk. In other words, okay, you did something, but did it actually work? That kind of traceability in terms of the verifications is really important for devices and combination products. I can't really think of a reason why it wouldn't be important for pharma, where if it's a product related risk, the consequences of failure can directly impact patient safety. So while ICH Q9 does consider risk controls, that explicit requirement for implementation verification, effectiveness verification is not always emphasized, which I think can maybe lead a gap in terms of just the documentation of traceability. So I thought those were really important to highlight. So both 14971 and ICH Q9 play a really important role in the development and manufacturing of combo products, but look at it in a different way. ISO 14971 gives a very specific, it gives us the rigor that we need to address device-specific patient safety-related risks in a structured life cycle focused way, where ICH Q9 is a little bit broader and makes sure that there's a risk-based thinking around any element that is done in the development and manufacturing pharma process. And I would just, like I said, add that the ICH or the ISO 13485 QMSR risk-based thinking, I think, is part of what is addressed in ICH Q9. And so with that, as always, if you enjoyed this episode, please leave a review, share it with anyone who you think might find it useful. And if you have any feedback for the show, do not hesitate to reach out. Or if you have any topics or questions that you would like answered, do not hesitate. And with that, see you next time.